Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome back to Moving Conversations. Again, I'm Brian Ritchie, and joining me as always is the lovely Nora St. John. How you doing this morning, Nora?
Very well, thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing great. Just got back from visiting you, and man, every time we get together, the conversations, the things we discuss and go into detail, and the fun we have is never ending. And I always leave sort of with my brain a little on fire on certain topics and thinking of things that maybe I wouldn't have thought of just generally on my own. So it's always neat to have that sort of, counterplay back and forth that we have.
Well, that's why we do this, right? And for those who don't know, we filmed a bunch of our anatomy minis, which will be coming out at some point. These are just short little Instagram clips on topics of interest, which we hope you'll enjoy. So those will be coming out, sometime this fall. Keep an eye out for them.
Yeah, keep an eye out. We will definitely be doing an introduction podcast for it. So that way you'll know exactly when they launch and to keep an eye out. And, once or twice a week, you'll get something in your Instagram file that'll be fun from us and, a little goofy, but definitely educational all at the same time.
Yep, a little thought-provoking. We call them little thought seeds, right? Something you can just think about and contemplate as you watch your clients move and think about, what is happening in that joint? Or what does that actually mean? So just give you something to think about, way to focus on your training and then get a little deeper into it.
Yeah, and today we're going to get deep into the cervical spine.
Woohoo!
Yeah,
where is our head?
Yes, exactly. I could go a lot of places with that, but I'm gonna hold back on that thought. Something about the neck has always eluded a lot of people because it's so fragile. It's something that I can't tell you how many clients I've had come in with neck pain, cervical strain, herniations, arthritis, et cetera, et cetera. We'll get into those more in detail, but it's an area that people don't seem to understand very much. And a lot of trainers and a lot of Pilates instructors really don't do a deep dive into it. So I thought that'd be kind of a neat place for us to go today.
When you think about how important it is and how we are using it all the time, right? It's a critical part of who we are as humans, is having a neck that's attached to a head that then responds to our senses, and how much, that can affect how we stand, how we walk, how we move, how we perceive the world. The fact that we don't really talk about it much. We'll do exercises with it. We'll do a little extension. We'll do a little flexion. We'll go look side to side. We don't really think about it in terms of what that means and what the deeper ways that the neck is responding to the head and the rest of the body. What's that about? What are we looking at there?
Something that I heard a long time ago is where the head goes, the body will follow. And, where I grew up in Kailua, we had a rodeo that was right in our town, basically. I grew up, where we would call Paniolo, country, cowboy land in Hawaii. And so we would go once, twice a year, and you'd see the calf, wranglers, basically, or wrestlers who would, rope them and then jump down. And I always found it fascinating that they could take down a calf that weighs, 1,000 pounds, 800 pounds, whatever it is, so much strength, so much power. And my dad explained to me, he said, but look what he's doing. He's twisting the neck, and where the head goes, the body will automatically follow. So he twists it far enough that the body flops over. And ever since then, that's been in my brain, that where the head goes, the body will follow. And it's very true with what we do.
Yep, that's a great image. It's a perfect image, yeah.
And
so
go ahead, please.
I'm going to take that one more step, which is, some of that with humans is because our senses are in our head. Our eyes are in our head, our ears are in our head, our nose is in our head, our mouth is in our head. So our senses are a lot, especially visual for humans, is a lot of what determines where our head's going, right? Something catches our eye and we move in that direction. If we're running in a certain direction, we're going to be looking in that direction, looking at the ground to make sure we're not tripping on something. So much for me of how the head responds is yes, the body follows the head, and I would say the head follows the senses.
Interesting. I never put that together for me, and I don't know why. It totally makes sense that all of the senses would be in play. For me, it's always been more about sight, you know. And just because when you hear about a writing reflex, you hear about how our eyes are always seeking the horizon line. And, you can see people who come in and they may be all their, neck there is really tight on one side. They've got their shoulders up higher on one side, but their eyes are always sort of level for the most part. I did have one gentleman, which always threw me off. His head was at about a 30-degree tilt, never
Mm-hmm.
changed. And he was a district court judge in Hawaii, and his head always tilted to the right. And then when I learned about the writing reflex, I'm like, how does he fight that? And I guess his body just became accustomed to it over years and years. It never straightened out. It just wouldn't go up straight, his neck, and it wasn't fused. So I always found that fascinating and was basically told, don't mess with it. It's just the way he is. And it
Yeah.
doesn't, he had no pain. It just, his head
Yeah.
looked like he was always talking on an invisible phone all the
Right.
time.
I was looking into this a long time ago for some clients, and one of the things that came out of that, which was interesting, was a lot of speculation. So, guys, this is conjecture time, okay? So, take this as just thoughts. A lot of theories about how the neck develops and the neck musculature develops, particularly, has to do with how our eyes and our ears develop. So there is some research that says, let's say if a child is deaf in one ear or has very, very different vision in one eye versus the other, that will directly influence the development of the musculature of their neck. Right, and that was really what tuned me into that idea that the senses directly relate to the structure of the neck and how those muscles build. Because if you think about it, and I think about a good friend of mine who's relatively deaf in one ear, when he looks at you, he's always tipping just a little to put that ear closer to
Mm-hmm.
you. Right, or if you think about if somebody drops something very close to you, you jump, you turn, and you look in the direction of that loud noise.
Yeah.
Right. So both those things, and even somebody has very uneven vision, right? So in other words, their focal depth to get three-dimensional focus, they have to turn their head a little bit so their eyes can focus on that same point. So all of that really leads me to think about how much the senses influence the neck and particularly the development of tension and strength patterns within the neck.
And I can definitely see that, especially for tension patterns. Because if
Mm-hmm.
someone is constantly tilting their head one way or leaning a little bit, you can see how the musculature is going to basically compensate and begin to create that torque or whatever it is. If someone's turning or leaning or something, it's going to adjust to that over long periods of time.
Right. You create your fascial suit, right?
Yes.
And whatever you do, your body responds to and tries to reinforce that so it's more comfortable for you.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Well, why don't we dive into the anatomy? Because much like the hands and feet, there's so much going on in a very small amount of space. Because if you think about it, I
Yeah.
mean, just on your own body, put your hands on your collarbone and then walk it up all the way towards your jawline. And basically, it's not a whole lot of space. In comparison
No.
to the thoracic or even the lumbar spine, it's not a lot of space. We're talking about maybe on some long necked, people who have, relatively longer, more graceful swan like necks, we're talking what, maybe 8 inches?
Yeah.
On the average
Yeah.
person, I think it's probably 5. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of space, but there's a lot going on and there's a lot of musculature that happens in
Yeah.
here. And a lot of musculature that affects other things like your jaw, like chewing, mastication,
Right.
you know,
Yep.
things of that nature, even just holding the head still, up in the occipitals. There's a lot of muscles that are doing this. And one that I think we tend to forget about are ones that you and I have talked about at length is the deep cervical flexors.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, guys, this is one of those areas that people don't talk about. This is the longest coli and the longest capitis, are the two muscles we're primarily talking about here. I sometimes think of these as being the psoas of the neck, only because they're on the front of the spine, which
Mm-hmm.
most of our muscles are on the back of the spine. They're on the front of the spine, and they really connect segmentally, vertebra to vertebra, from really the base of the occiput all the way down to the thorax, and a variety of different connections there. And so that those are the muscles that can bring your chin down, right? Do your head nod closest to the joints, right? We think about our sternocleidomastoid, that big muscle that you can see from your kind of underneath your mastoid process, or just in front of your ear to your collarbone, that sticks out when you turn your head to one side or the other. But these are deep to that. They're deep to our windpipe. They're deep to everything. They're deep to our throat, right? They're right behind all of that. So they're closest to the bones and give you the most opportunity to actually nod that chin, right? Bring that chin down and open up those those upper cervical muscles, give our upper cervical vertebra, and really bring them into flexion.
Interesting. Now, we've talked about protraction and retraction, you and I, and how, unlike other areas of the body where we just think of flexion and extension, it's a combination where the uppermost are doing extension, uppermost cervical vertebrae, whereas the lower cervical vertebrae are doing flexion. What are the deep cervical flexors doing in that? Are they shortening? Are they elongating? I've always wondered this because even if I just do it myself, it seems like they're shortening to a certain degree, but elongating to a certain degree. Or is it just that they're segmentally doing different things?
They're pretty segmental when you look at them. They really attach, vertebra to vertebra, and then kind of chunks of vertebra to chunks of vertebra. So, good question. But my feeling is when I look at them and when I see how they work and when I notice somebody who's really using them, that they are, when you're bringing your chin down, when you're basically extending the upper cervical vertebra, that they're contracting, right? They're contracting all the way down into your thorax. And if you then go and let's say you're lying on the ground, nod your chin and then lift your head, they're contracting even further. And when you look at them again, there's the capitis right up at the top of the head. Perhaps those are less strong, right? So those guys have a little more ability to really let your neck go into that cervical extension up at the top. But also think about how many muscles at the back of the neck are going to encourage cervical extension. You've got layers and layers and layers going from the outside, like the occiput, the skull, down, layers on the skull, and then layers onto the cervical vertebra, right? Deep, 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 deep. So there's a lot of muscles that are designed to extend our neck.
When I think of these muscles, I sort of go back into our spinal stabilizers. I spent most of my career focusing a lot on the lumbar spine. And you think of those spinal stabilizers, and they're mostly on the posterior side, obviously. A little bit lateral, but they're mainly attached back there. But the psoas is also, because of where it attaches, on the transverse process on the bodies of the vertebrae, and it's sort of on the sides and anterior. It's more of an anterior spinal stabilizer. So these deep cervical flexors really are sort of the anterior stabilizers of the neck, so to speak.
Absolutely. And again, if they're deepest to the joint, right? We talk a lot when talking about the core, you talk about the abdominals, but the abdominals are very distant from the joints they're acting on.
Yes, they are.
Right? They really are. They're not directly connected to the joints they're acting on. The psoas is really, the psoas and then all the erector spinae and all the spinal muscles are the muscles that are closest to the joints they're acting on. And same thing in the cervical spine, that the longest colli and longest capitis are the only two that are really where the joints are really at the joint level, right?
So if you think about it, the sternocleidomastoid and the scalenes are almost like your abdominals. They're the furthest away in a small space. Obviously, in our abdominals, we have a lot more because we have organs and whatnot there. But if you think about it, those are the big movers, but almost the more important ones are the ones that actually help align the spine, keep it stabilized, and actually assist with flexion and extension right there along the spine, especially anteriorly, the flexors, the deep cervical flexors.
Right. The other thing that I like to do, and you guys can join us on this one at home, this is easy to do. If you just put your hands, this is not looking in the anterior, just look at the posterior, but if you put your hands behind your neck and you feel both sides of your erector spinae, so I'm just off of my spinous processes, right on either side, and you just, nod your head forward and back. or what I often have somebody do is do this on the ground and push their head into the floor. And very often you'll feel that even those erector spinae are not even on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Much like we do with the multifidi with the low back,
Mm-hmm.
you get the same issue up in the cervical spine, that you'll feel like one side of those erector spinae are firmer or more developed or thicker than the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you can have that imbalance both between the front and the back, but you can also have that imbalance between the two sides and the
And
back.
we never think of the imbalance when it comes to the cervical. That's not something that we
Mm-mm.
discuss much.
No.
We may talk about the scalenes. And again, when we think about this, when I've spoken to physical therapists and physicians, they go to the scalenes almost always first, especially someone who has a forward
Yeah.
head carriage or whatnot, because they're usually tight and they want to get those muscles to stretch, to release, get to a good body worker or have us stretch it, etc. But I've never heard, from a doctor and rarely from a physical therapist to really focus on balancing out the anterior, posterior, or lateral side to side of these muscles, the same way we would if we were talking about the lumbar spine, where someone lies down and you can see one side of their low back is a chunk and the other side
Yeah.
is just not a concave, but just flat.
Right.
And you can really see, oh, okay, we need to create balance there, but they don't talk about that in the cervical nearly, I haven't heard it at least.
No, and this is something that I worked a lot. One of my teachers, Diana Harold, had a lot of neck issues when I was working with her at St. Francis Hospital in Pilates. And so she did a lot of work herself on her neck because she had a lot of issues there and really taught us a lot about the neck in that process. And this is one of those things that really came up not from anybody else. We just, we were lying on the ground and we were playing with where's our head and what's happening with our musculature around our neck. And that gentle, again, supine, gentle pressing back, that retraction of the head right into the mat. And it was like, oh, only my left side's firing. And based on what we do with the multifidi, what we do with the erector spinae, I've had very good results with a lot of low back pain, balancing out those erector spinae and getting the side that's not firing to fire a little more and the other one to fire a little less. I thought, well, why don't we do that in the cervical
Yeah.
spine? It's really much more vulnerable in many ways than the lumbar.
No kidding.
And much more prone to imbalances. If you think about somebody being right eye dominant or having, their workstation slightly to the left, I mean, all those things are going to give people a perpetual slight imbalance in those muscles.
Yeah. That's really interesting because, like I say, it's not something we really bring up. But like you said, we talk about it all the time when we talk about our core. We talk about, one side being stronger. We're naturally rotated from one side to the other. And we think about, those oblique slings and things like that. But if you think about it, it's just as important for us to balance out the cervical, the anterior to posterior and lateral side to side.
Right. And what happens to our cervical? Like what people get a lot of neck problems.
Oh my gosh.
Right. Whether it's just, my neck's stiff, it's sore, just from work or life. I can't lift my head. I know in Pilates, because we do a lot of abdominal curls of various kinds, oftentimes unsupported. People are like, oh, I hate Pilates. It makes my neck hurt. And then beyond that, whiplash, arthritis. I've had more than one client who've had cervical fusions because their vertebrae have just been a mess back there, disc problems from the cervical spine, all that, right? And a lot of that is because we have these chronic wear and tear situations of imbalance going on.
Yeah. It's interesting. I remember I was working underneath my truck for a prolonged period of time. And I'm a pretty good sized guy, but working under the truck, I found myself, of course, leaning my head forward, trying to see something, but lying on my back. My head wasn't supported, and I'm working with my hands. And at the time, I didn't feel much. But oh my gosh, was my neck sore for a week afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was like I did lunges with my head. I mean, it literally was.
Which you did.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, what did I do? And I'm like, oh, I was only under there for, I figured a brief period of time, but I was under there long enough. And again, lifting my head. Now, we all know this bowling ball of ours, I've heard, 15 to 18 pounds. I'm sure everybody's is slightly different. But it's on this very small platform that it has to sit on.
Yeah. Yep.
And even if we just talk about something as simple as forward head carriage, which a lot of people, If you're listening to us drive right now, I guarantee you just got better posture because you heard about this and you probably sat up a little straighter. But when you sit there with your head forward, we are in protraction. All of a sudden, that bowling ball is now leaning forward. And depending on how far it leans forward, the amount of weight goes up exponentially the further it goes.
It can change, again, based on one slightly random, there's always different graphics on this.
Right.
But from, 12, 15, 10, somewhere in that range, people have different, again, rates for that, up to 60 pounds. If you're really forward, for example, looking at your phone, and you really are just like into a game or you're into something and your head is as far forward as it can comfortably go, that's 60 pounds that you are trying to hold up.
Yep.
Right. And again, where is most of the work in our neck? It's going to be in our back body. Holding our head from falling off is going to happen primarily through our cervical extensors and all of our retrospinae and all the muscles in the back of our head, which also creates that imbalance between the front and the back.
Not only that, something else I think about a lot, and this was brought up to me by a physical therapist years ago, is when we do have our head at that sort of peak moment that it's as far down as it's going to be, the muscles actually try and turn off, and the ligaments are doing most of the holding up all of a sudden.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
So it's not just the musculature. The muscles eventually are holding on. Forget it. I'm done.
I give up.
Yeah. And suddenly it's just ligaments that are holding on. And those ligaments, as we all know, they can stretch. And if they overstretch, they may not come back, which is where we see dowager's hump, where we do see people who may be able to get their head in the right position, but they've been doing it for so many years that those ligaments don't remember what to do anymore and can't get in proper position. So suddenly they go into bad posture over and over and over again.
Right. And then you've got instability too, right?
Oh,
the
yes.
ligaments aren't doing their job. Then you've got instability in the cervical spine, which instability in any joint makes it a little more likely that it's going to get wear and tear, right? It's not going to be moving with congruency in whatever action it's taking, and things can get a little out of whack, right?
Yeah. So we talked a little about the anatomy. Let's talk about, first of all, if you have a client that comes to you who has an issue with their neck. Let's not get into any specifics for discs or any of that stuff yet, arthritis, but just has an issue, maybe a strain of some sort, went to the physical therapist, etc. Where would you start with this person?
So typically I start, especially if there's a lot of pain there, and I've worked with a lot of clients with a lot of neck pain, I will typically start in as supported a position as possible. So I'll typically start supine, with their neck supported, their head supported, whatever angle and whatever amount of support they need to feel like their neck is relatively neutral on their torso, and their head and neck are both supported. So they've got contact from their upper thoracic through their cervical spine and through the back of their head. So all of that is touching, because a lot of times where I start is to try to find some relaxation in those muscles, because I find almost always with a neck problem, there's a lot of tension that has built up. So the first thing I want to do is try to relieve some of that tension. And from there, I typically go into some very gentle, again, gravity is not really working here, very gentle range of motion. Up, down, right, left, little circles, small motions, just little things to just get the joints moving and lubricated again.
It's interesting that you mention fully supported. And I'm going to take it to a different body part just as an analogy. When I stretch out people's calves, I have a calf board, which is basically just an incline. It's an incline plane. They stand on it, drop the heels. And a lot of clients will say, well, I do this off a curb. I've always noticed that when people do it off a curb, because the heel is not supported and sort of is hanging out in space, the muscles are always trying to help out a little bit. You'll feel a stretch, but they're always trying to help out a little bit. Whereas if the heel has contact, it can actually go, oh, I'm here. Oh, got it. And they can relax. Same thing with the neck. If you're only supporting the base of the head and not the neck doesn't feel the support. It's not going to be able to fully relax and let go completely. So I love the fact that you take it that extra step to make sure that it's supporting the entire, head, cervical, neck, everything complex. I love that.
I mean, if you don't, I mean, there's also just for most people, this isn't always true, but for most people, a natural reaction, if you touch a body part, if you touch a muscle, its reaction, again, with appropriate amount of force and that kind of thing, its reaction is to relax. Mm-hmm. If it feels like it's supported, it says, oh, I don't need to fire. So it goes, oh, okay, I'll chill. And with the neck, that's often where I'm starting, is I need to chill things out first and then start to build back the movement patterns from a place of balance and a place of relaxation rather than a place of strain and sort of superficial overactivation.
And I think that's another reason why I always gravitated toward, a larger Pilates ball, like the Togu ball, which is more like a 20-inch ball rather than a 9-inch ball. Because when it is mostly deflated, you can put their head on it, and it does cradle their neck. It actually cradles everything so they can relax. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone from having them on a bolster of some sort, which is mostly supporting their whole head, and put that under it, and you can see their scalenes let go. You can see their SCM let go, and you can see them relax fully. And this makes a lot of sense that, okay, they're getting that support. Their body neurologically is like, oh, I'm supported. I'm good. I can let it go.
Right. The other thing too, so for those guys who don't know, right, this is this ball, this blow-up ball that we deflate quite a bit and then put around the head. Kind of, I think it looks like a halo.
It does.
Because it kind of, it cradles the whole head and cradles the neck. One of the things I often think about when I'm working on that area, and once I've worked on a little bit of the relaxation piece and the general movement piece, is from an image perspective, I want to start thinking about each of the joints of the spine participating and how they're participating in whatever movement I'm doing. Mm-hmm. So thinking about, start way up at the atlanto-occipital joint or at the top and just let that do a little bit of a nod, right? Because that's kind of the yes part of the neck. Then I look at the second part, the atlanto-axial joint, and look at that one just a little bit of side to side. And then I kind of think about how all of those joints participate in any other motions that we're doing in the spine. Mm-hmm. Because oftentimes you'll find, like we do with the back, one particular area isn't moving very well. Maybe it's C1 to C2 isn't moving. You've got no rotation because some things are tightened up there. Or maybe there's no extension or no flexion or not much movement there. So when I start to think about that and use the image of that, I find it gets me out of the unconscious control of my neck, which I think most of us spend our life in, and more into thinking of it like we think of the rest of our body as a body part that has movement that we can make choices about.
Mm-hmm. I like that. It makes a lot of sense to sort of start there. I find that a lot of clients, when I get them for their neck, either they have seen a physical therapist or a physician, or it's something that has been chronic for the last 5 years, 10 years. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's always sore. It's always tight. And I do like to start them in the supine position where they are as relaxed as possible. The other thing that I try and get them to wrap their head around is awareness and postural awareness.
Yeah, exactly.
And just when they're sitting at their desk, sitting in their car, and do it for 5 seconds, just as they're sitting there, because something we haven't said yet, and this, we need to really blanket this, these are very small muscles. These
tiny.
Yeah, these are not big, strong muscles. They do not respond well to high repetition or to high weight. They like light work and very few repetitions, very few sets. And so sometimes it's just getting them aware of where they are in space and getting them to sit up properly and hold their head in position for 3 seconds, 5 seconds, and then let it go. And then do it again for 3 or 5 seconds and let it go. And if they're driving, I say every stoplight, do it for like 3 or 5 seconds. If they're at the office, once an hour. Just set a thing on their watch, that's to go off every hour. Once it goes off, just hold it 3, 2, 1, and then build up from there, 3 seconds to 5 seconds to 7 to 10. And you can do longer and longer periods over a period of time as you build up that endurance.
I love that. So that's getting more into, right. So release, relax, and awareness, a little bit of that through that. But then getting into, where does my head need to be?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So as you're talking about, and for that, I've used, a dowel behind their back, or not everybody is going to have their head all the way
No.
over their torso either. So, if they're very kyphotic structurally and they really don't have thoracic extension much, then I've got to figure out, where is their head, where is the best position for their
Yep.
head. It's not going to be fully pulled back, because at that point, you say, my voice just changed.
Yep.
So I really over protracted and pulled my neck way back. So then it's also, where does that need to go? So I'll maybe have them against a wall, or against oftentimes I use a foam roller or something behind them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have something between the foam roller and the back of their head.
Yep.
So they're still, again, still supported. They can still feel where that head needs to be and get some of that activation, but they're not having to pull it all the way back, because that's not appropriate for everybody either.
No, and that puts you more into extension. And you're going to find that they're probably going to compensate from their low back in order to achieve it. They're going to arch their back. You're going to see their ribs begin to, flare forward, and they're going
to pop up. Yep.
And that's not what we're looking for either. It reminds me, they need us to put them in the proper position, because they have no idea what proper position is anymore. They can't get there by themselves.
Yeah. No, that's 90% of the time that's true. That you say, stand up straight. And
I am.
And that's not what happens, right? I am. Right. So awareness, right? Postural awareness. Where am I, and what is happening, and where's my head, and and also, where can I hold it? Because it's always like, there's the awareness, and from awareness, I always find, is when you get the opportunity to make a different choice.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, well, I'm thinking about my brother-in-law, who's a lawyer, and I know you work in DC, where there's an awful lot of lawyers.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And I remember watching him read like a brief, or read a paper. His head was always forward, always forward. And that's just where he lived. And, he did a lot of computer work, of course, but he also would take documents home and read them. And I'm thinking, wow, you spend so much time in that position.
Yep.
Not being aware of it.
And that becomes your default. So to them,
that becomes how it is.
Is their proper posture to their brain. If you just said, where does your neck live? It's here, and it's in that protracted position. I remember myself lying on my back, no problem. I could find it. Even sitting up, I could find proper posture. But for me, I found that helped me the most was getting into quadruped, which is an advanced position when you're talking about cervical. It is. But I had an instructor who, once I went into that position, that's when we found, I had no strength, because my head immediately dipped forward, and I didn't even know it. I mean, I was just holding quadruped, focusing on my shoulders, focusing on all that. And it was like, okay. And she had to literally put my head in proper position, and I held it. And after about 3 seconds, I even noticed, hey, the ground's coming toward my face. What's going on? And I realized I'm losing those muscles already in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
But once she put me in the proper position, and again, I've got good body awareness. I've been doing this a long time. I was able to say, okay, got it. Here's where I need to be. And I anchored it, worked on it for the next week, that when I saw her the next session, she said, wow, you got this. And I said, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to figure this out. Come hell or high water, this is going to be figured out. But our clients don't always have that dedication. They have to want it, first of all. But I think, that's another thing, is to get them into different positions where you are sitting, maybe sitting on a ball, sitting in a chair. Put them in their office chair or in your office chair, and get them in proper position. Maybe teach them, okay, they can get something that can prop the document up in front of them, so they're not leaning so far forward, or suggest they go get better reading glasses if that's what is necessary.
Right, exactly. If they're going forward to get their focal length going.
Yeah. And finding, changing the position so that awareness is now being challenged. And again, you go from the supine position where they're fully relaxed, comfortable, the release technique, get them aware of it there. I begin doing some isometrics in that position. That's where I'll start them with. Just gentle retraction, gentle rotation, usually on the togu ball or something similar, even into a pillow, that's giving them enough support so they're not flaring things up. Then work on awareness, in different positions. Again, seated is fairly gentle. Supine's the most. Seated or even standing is more gentle, and getting them into that proper position, but then beginning to challenge them where they're maybe offset a little bit, into a quadruped
Right. Yeah.
or a
Where gravity's
supine.
hitting them differently. Yeah.
Exactly, because we need to challenge that, because they're not
Yeah.
always going to be in good posture. And let's face it, as soon as their head bops forward, it's not that far off from being in that quadruped position. Gravity is pulling their head down.
So two things I wanted to just circle back on that you said. One was the endurance piece, and this is really important, and I find is not just important for training, but I find is the key to client compliance, right? Because if you say yes, just try to hold your best posture for 8 hours a day, they're going to look at you like you have lost your mind.
Yep.
I can't do that. Right. And I know for myself, when I'm trying to change something like that, that's that habituated, it's like, okay, so I'm going to do it and we'll set a clock, I'll set a timer for a minute or whatever, one block if I'm doing a walking change, right? One block, and then I let it go completely. Then it's like, I'm not going to think about it for this next period of time. And then I'm going to bring it up back into my consciousness and let it go completely. I found that number one, clients can do that because they won't get so fatigued and so irritated that they just stop. And two, that's how you have to build up that endurance, because as you said, very often that endurance is not there at all.
Yep.
For holding that posture. It really will be, and they'll get that fatigue through the whole upper back. Their neck will get tired, and they'll complain bitterly.
Yep.
Some of them.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. No, endurance is incredibly important, and I found that that's whenever we talk about muscles, and I speak on this in my classes. You have your stabilizers and mobilizers. Well, these are really much more the stabilizers because they need endurance. They need to hold you still and in good posture for long periods of time. They don't need to provide a lot of strength. They don't have a lot of torque. It's not like you're trying to lift something with your head. You're just trying to hold your head in position.
Right.
But again, for long periods of time, much like your soleus, you stand for a long period of time. Well, guess what? That muscle's firing the whole time, and it needs to. That's a muscle of endurance. It needs to be able to have you stand upright. Well, it's the same thing. All of these muscles need to be firing properly to keep you balanced, to keep that ball balanced on top of this thin little pole.
Yep. The thing I want to bring up, because we've talked a lot, and I mentioned it a bunch of times about this kind of idea of lengthening the cervical spine, the upper cervicals, right? Getting a little bit more, not even flexion, just length and space in those upper cervicals, that they tend to get really crunched, especially with forward head, right? You think about that, it's like, boom, right? That sharp extension at that very top piece.
Yep.
And a lot of times, the classic exercise for that is just a retraction, right? Drawing the jaw. There we go, straight back, right? Or putting your head against a wall or against the floor and pushing back into it. One of the things that I just wanted to refine there is I've seen a lot of people do that a lot of different ways. So I've seen them do it by tucking the chin down, by lifting the chin up. And what I really want to think about, this is the image I sometimes use, is imagine your chin is on a counter, right? Which is a little silly, or, on a ledge or something. And you're basically just sliding your chin right along that ledge.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. So you're not, and the other image I use is that your jaw is like a drawer in a dresser. And so, the drawer goes forward, the drawer goes back in, the drawer goes forward, the drawer goes back in. And it's not going to fall out or fall up, right? Because that's, I just see that done incorrectly so often. So I try to get that idea that really you're just pulling it back.
Yep. I like that, because that is an image that we have a difficult time explaining to clients, is retraction, because they go into extension.
Yeah.
They immediately pull back and their eyes go toward the ceiling, and you say, no, keep your eyes on the horizon line. And then they start looking down like they're looking down their nose at you. It's like, no, we still don't want to.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah, I like that idea. The shelf idea, actually, I like that, because you can say, keep your chin on the shelf as you pull it away, and it is.
Don't lift it off.
Don't lift it off.
Yeah.
And that does sort of work. I have used the drawer technique before, and I usually say your whole head is a drawer. Now, the drawer can't go up and can't go down. It just has to push straight out.
It's in the slot. Good.
And sometimes that does help. Visualization helps people immensely. So whatever cue will get that particular client going, by all
Yep.
means, use that one.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
what I also like for this exercise is not just the retraction, but adding at the very end a little bit of a face nod just to open
Mm.
up that occipitoatlantal space, because that really is what gets crunched.
Mm.
So as they
Yeah.
retract back now, especially if they're in the supine position, just nod the face down just a little bit and it just opens that up just a hair. And I'll say an inch. Just bring your nose down an inch. And a lot of times that'll open it up just enough. And it's great in a supine position because you can really have them retract, hold the retraction, and do a few of those face nods. And after a few of them, they say, wow, I can really feel it stretching out right there
Yeah.
along the base of my skull.
Perfect. Really nice stretch for that exact spot. Beautiful.
And that's exactly what you're looking for, that spot.
Yeah.
You know,
Love that.
I remember when I was doing a lot more body work that I could make anybody happy by I called it clawing their brain. By just those muscles, those occipital muscles were so tight on almost everybody that literally just having them lie down and putting my fingertips right at the occiput
Oh yeah.
and
I
having
know. It's like,
them
oh,
relax, and the pressure on the muscles. I wasn't even doing traction, but what would happen is
yeah.
as they relaxed, I would find their neck would lengthen and that
Yep.
pressure would be right on those muscles that they just be, oh, just stay here all day. You can stay here all day. I'll
Exactly.
pay you whatever you want. Just stay here all day. But
Yeah, that tension.
yeah, those are the muscles that really do so much work. And I mean, Google it sometime. These small muscles, the occipital muscles, how small they really are, how teeny tiny they are, and how much work they do all day long. If you are in that forward head carriage, they are always tightened up.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you think about it, what do you do naturally if you are looking at your phone and your head is in your lap and someone calls your name? Are you going to retract and pull back and have your head be nice? No, you're going to jut it straight up.
Yep.
And what happens to that area? Crunch.
Yep.
That area is going to crunch. And that's what we see time and time again. So you see people at their desk, they're writing, someone calls their name, they look up, crunch. And that happens over and over again. Those muscles are basically holding up their head, and they're teeny tiny muscles. Of course they're going to get strained. It's just bound to happen to some people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then that causes headaches, and it causes neck aches, and it causes repetitive, RSI stuff, repetitive stress injuries and stuff into the rest of the body, because that tension through the neck feeds down into the thorax, feeds it into the shoulder girdle, and can end up with carpal tunnel and other kinds of things.
Yep.
Right? Because those cervical nerves come out and innervate the whole upper body.
Now I've got a question for you. I'm going to, based on a lot of what we've just been talking about, we have the client who tends to overuse their neck during exercise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you put them on the reformer. We put them on the ground. We have them do something even as simple as marching, footwork on the reformer. And you're watching them, and immediately their neck, you can see their scalenes and SCM are jumping. And you have a light resistance. It has nothing to do with their neck, but they're trying to lift their body with their neck. You can see they're trying to,
Yeah.
How do you get them to calm that down? I'm thinking of one client in particular, and I've got my techniques and things, but I'm curious, I want to learn from you as well. What techniques you have to get those muscles to calm down when they're doing those exercises.
So the main thing is I just try to support the neck. So I'll typically use a towel roll under the neck. I'll adjust the position again of the thorax, the upper thoracic, the cervical spine, and the head, so it's as relatively neutral as possible. If it is like the SCM and those guys, I'm also looking to see what are they trying to do? Are they trying to flex the head along with it? Like, is that because if those are popping up, that's typically what they're trying to do is flex the head. Sometimes what I need to do then is actually bring the head forward, right? Rather than having it be flat and in line. So that's where like a little bit of a head lift. And for those of you who work on reformers, you may love the headrest. That's great. I do not love the headrest. I'm going to just say the angle of it, even when you tip it up, do the little kickstands, and it doesn't work for a lot of my clients at all. It puts their head in a weird position. So I'm much more inclined to use towels. I've got a whole bunch of, Target's favorite towels in my studio, and I roll them up so I can have just whatever roll I need to support their cervical spine. And then I'll also pad up their head as much as I need to. It gives me that customizability to really let the neck be relaxed as the rest of the body's working. One other little trick, and this is again reformer related specifically, is if their shoulders are smashing into the shoulder rests, that will also create the neck tension.
Yes.
So for that, actually, either I'll have them pull away from the shoulder rests and hold on to the carriage with their fingers at the bottom of it, or what worked pretty well was foam sponges. Like, so the kind of those big yellow car sponges, that are kind of big and puffy. I'll put those between their shoulders and the shoulder rest. And that'll often allow them to like move their shoulders against it, but not come into that firmness of the shoulder rest, which will also decrease some of that neck tension.
Yeah. What works for me, you mentioned, is bringing them into a little bit of flexion to shorten those muscles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because when you shorten those muscles, I find that when their head is held back, those muscles are sort of saying, oh, okay, I have to hold on. I got to hold on for dear life to hold this head up. Even though it's supported, it still wants to. So if you bring them into slight flexion, it'll shorten them even more, and those muscles can begin to relax, especially if you're doing something that involves the core, because those muscles are basically attached fascially right down the sternum, right into the linea alba, and they're going to try and lift your entire body with your neck.
Yes.
And I can tell you from experience, it doesn't work, but they're going to try. The other thing on the reformer that I found, and this made all the sense to me when I first, tried it, is I put additional resistance on. The tendency is for people to think, oh, they need less. We need to put less resistance. But less resistance means they're holding up their legs somewhat. They're holding up their body somewhat.
Yeah. Depending, they can be using more tension to hold themselves together.
Exactly. Whereas you put just a little bit more resistance, not a lot, don't load them up too much, but a little bit more, and suddenly they're not trying to hold up their body as much.
Right.
I find that especially when you get into more advanced exercises and the feet are off the foot bar at all, then suddenly everything's putting a little bit more assistance here and there can make a big difference.
Yep, absolutely. One other thing that I want to mention, and this gets more into, so two things. One thing that I will almost always do with my clients with neck issues is simple isometrics.
Yes.
Usually standing, and I just, I call it my fingertip isometrics. And just, one finger in the front of the forehead, one finger in the back of the head, the side, and then I do the corners as well.
Yep.
Right, so the diagonals, if you will. And I'll start with that, especially with somebody who's post whiplash or or even a cervical disc problem or something like that, gently. And what I find is the more fingers, the more resistance. So I'll start with one finger, one finger, and maybe we just do one round, one point on each place. Maybe we repeat, several times in one direction, several times in another, and slowly build that up. And I find that is how I always start with my 3-dimensional strengthening. And you'll often find that one angle or one position is like either harder or more painful than another. And then also where to focus your work or to not focus your work.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I do something called a cervical statue where I stand behind them and I put, I want to say like half a finger.
Yeah.
You start with very, very little, and all I do is just say, I just want you to stay still. Don't push against me. Just stay still. Because what I find is pushing against you, you're going to see they're going to jut out into protraction or extension for retraction, or they're going to lean side to side. That if I say, just don't let me move you, and I push very gently, and I'll tell them, don't move. Don't let me move you. And that's a way that I begin them to hold that proper position. And what I find is that after 2 or 3 of the repetitions, their head is already getting out of position. And I have to reposition and then start again, reposition until they know where their head is in space. And then I can ramp up the speed. I don't like to ramp up the pressure. I'll ramp up the speed a little bit so that they can sort of withstand that pressure coming from an unknown direction, because
Right.
that's real life. That's what's going to happen in real life. And again, this is something that you start out incredibly light. And I do it for my athletes, especially when I need to get them ready to get back on the
Yeah.
field or whatnot, because
Yeah.
they need to be able to withstand, much more torque than my 65-year-old who does occasional gardening,
Yeah. Absolutely.
you know?
And for me, like I've seen you do this statue a lot, and I love it for both the core generally and then for the neck specifically. Um, for me, I do that second. So I start with
Yes,
just the simple isometrics, and then I go into this because the statue is just less predictable. And I find with my clients with neck injuries, there's something about the neck that is all about control from a psychological standpoint, and they need to be comfortable enough to be able to be, to have that unpredictability, or they're
sure.
like, blah, they
Yep.
get a little freaked out.
No, I totally get that. Yep. And it is something that is later on down the road. Now,
Yeah,
we just went into, sort of the different stages of training for
yeah,
cervical issues. Understand that this isn't done in 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
mm-mm,
This is
mm-mm,
3 months, 6 months,
mm-hmm.
sometimes longer, depending on how long they've been in pain, because some of these clients have had neck pain for a long period of time. And I often find it's my women who have a little longer
Mm-hmm.
necks, who are a little
Mm-hmm.
bit lighter of weight, someone who I would look at and think, ooh, they may be a candidate for osteoporosis. Just because they're thinner, they don't have a whole lot of musculature and probably were never involved in athletics or something like that. So they never really strengthened those muscles as a child. And if a lot of my seniors
Mm-hmm.
that I work with are people over the age of 55 or 60, a lot of them didn't really do a whole lot of sports when they were growing up.
Yeah,
Females, the men all
yeah,
did,
yeah.
but the women didn't have the same options as today's generation does.
Right,
You know,
absolutely.
my 40-year-olds now, they all played soccer and basketball and all of that. It's fantastic, but my 55 to 60-year-olds didn't do it as much, and older than that, it was even less. Tennis was the only thing that was ladylike in certain, regards.
My grandma bought her first pair of pants to wear to workout class when she was 92. And she was born in 1897.
Wow.
Right. So she wore dresses until like literally the last 3 years of her life. She bought her first pair of, stretchy polyester pants to wear to her workout class at her senior center.
Yeah,
So, that's a generation. I mean, that's a long time ago, but that's a generational shift, right?
absolutely. And we
Yeah.
see that. I talk with a lot of my seniors about that, and they weren't expected to do any of those type of things.
No. Mm-mm.
That wasn't
Mm-mm.
for them. And
No.
those are the clients, though, that are the ones that tell me that they're experiencing more neck pain,
Yeah.
oftentimes. And that takes some time. If it's been that way for 20 years, don't expect to erase that over a short period of time.
Well, also to bring this back to what we were talking about before, chances are good that they're not going to change that habit that is causing that pain
Yeah.
very quickly, right? Because if you're like many clients, they have to work, they live their life, they're doing whatever they're doing, and those are all habits. And our neck is a key part of our habits. How we use the phone, how we chop, how we lift something up, how we
Yep.
drive, all those things. So that's I think why that takes so long, is because you're not just strengthening an area and balancing out an area. You are changing a habit and a lifestyle and ergonomic setups and how
Mm-hmm.
people live their life. And that's what takes the time, in
Yeah,
my opinion.
it does. I find that also takes time just to build up those endurance fibers
Yeah.
of
Yes.
those
Yep.
particular muscles, because
Yep.
they take more time. Because it's not like your core where you can start someone, they can't do a plank, but they can do it off of a wall or off of a
Right.
table, and they get stronger and they get stronger and they get stronger. And after 6 weeks of progressing, suddenly they're doing relatively challenging things. Well, the
Yeah.
neck is not that,
It's not like that.
not at
No.
all. And so you have to respect that.
No. Yep. And it'll respond negatively to a variety of things, right? You really have to make sure that it's not getting overused and overdone.
Yes. And this is where feedback from your client is so important
Yep.
because they need to let you know if you've gone too far one time.
Yeah.
Because you might try something new. You might try a different position if you're going from seated or supine, and suddenly you take them into quadruped or you take them into prone position and are doing some gentle head lifts of 2 or 3 repetitions, nothing too much. But they come in the next time, and some people are just very stoic and they won't say a word because they think it's part of the process. You have to be able to say, how'd it go? And if they say, oh, I was very sore. Oh, okay. They may not be ready for that yet. They may
Right.
need to take a
Back it up.
take a half a step backwards and find another way to introduce that down the road, and be willing to do that. Listen, see how they respond to that. Because I promise you this, you go too far too fast, they will leave because the pain
Yeah.
will increase and
Yeah. That's
they're not
not
going to
good.
hang around for that.
We're getting close to our time. A
Yep.
couple of final thoughts. One is, so posture, habit, this whole idea of supporting the neck, getting the relaxation first, gently building up strength, and really along with that, really helping them with their habits, with their posture, with how they hold their phone, with how they do their computer, with how they sleep. What is their pillow situation?
Hadn't discussed
I've
that.
used this as I've used a silly example before, but if somebody is prone, if they like to sleep on their stomach and they've got a neck problem, those don't go together well. Like that, those just don't go together well.
Yeah, no, that's not going to work right.
No, and people, they're unconscious when they're sleeping, so they may end up in it. I've had many clients who fall asleep on their side or on their back and wake up on their stomach
Yep.
every time. And this is silly, but one time I had a client who bought a big old T-shirt with a pocket and sewed a tennis ball into that pocket.
Yep.
Right? So every time they rolled over, it's like, ow, and it stopped them.
Yep.
But that's what they had to do to keep from doing that and irritating their neck every single night.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I think the one thing the one take home that I think we need to focus in on for this is be gentle.
Mm-hmm.
Start them with awareness.
Yes.
Start them with relaxation and awareness first. Get them in a comfortable position. Get them into their body. Let them know where their head is in space. Before you ever try and load them, before you ever even try and do movement, really let them understand, oh, here's where my neutral is. Oh, okay. And then you can begin doing isometrics. Then you can begin to gently
and slowly.
Yeah.
And one thing we mentioned too is if you're working with somebody with a neck injury as part of your personal training practice or your Pilates practice, don't focus on the neck for very long in any given session.
Great advice too.
Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes.
Yep.
Right? Maybe just a little something. And then maybe remind them in other exercises for other parts of the body just to make sure that that's staying calm or staying in whatever position you want it to be in. But really don't keep the focus strongly on the neck for a long period of time during a session. You will wear them out.
Yeah. And for my personal trainers out there, something that I've used, with great assistance and success are incline benches.
Mm-hmm.
Because I can have them do a rowing exercise. Now, oftentimes we do a row, we're in a seated position, we're upright, we're unsupported a lot of times, or even if we're supported against something against our chest, our head's out in space. Whereas if I have them lean back, I can take them to a cable cross or any type of cable machine or even band or tubing and have them lean back at an incline so their head is relaxed on the bench.
Yeah. Yeah.
They can now do their rowing. They can do any of those exercises, and I can have them in proper neck position and be able to monitor. And again, we start off very light, but this goes back to the whole, okay, we're not going to focus on the neck. We're going to focus on all the other muscles and get those stronger, but let's put you in the best possible position and not have you strain yourself.
Absolutely.
And
that's great.
I find that works really, really well because then they know where their body needs to be and they can feel their head against it. And even then, sometimes what I'll do a gentle reminder about is slight retraction. If you notice their head wants to
Mm-hmm.
come forward, just remind them. Just push back half a pound, just a little bit. And then they'll go,
Yep.
oh, got it. You know, you don't want to say, push your head back. You know, just remind
Right.
them, keep their head against
Yep.
that. And that little reminder can make a world of difference.
Awesome.
So a couple of
Love
take-homes,
it.
today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's wrap this up. Any parting thoughts you'd like to say on the neck?
I think you summarized it really well there, Brian. I think it's, move slowly, move gently, really look for
Yes.
feedback from the client and understand that whatever you're doing, you have to also be working on their ergonomics, on their posture, on however they're holding themselves in the rest of their life, because that's really where a lot of neck sprain is going to be coming from. So, do your work, but really focus on that awareness piece.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you very much for joining us for another episode. I think a fascinating episode of Moving Conversations. If you want to get in touch with us, movingcombos@gmail.com. We'll answer any questions. If you have an idea or a thought that, hey, I'd really like to know more about this, that's where you can get in touch with us. That's where you can really reach out, get in touch. Keep your eyes on Instagram. Anatominis are coming. They're coming, in the next, hopefully in the next month, we'll be able to launch that and get those out there. And yeah, so those are two areas you can find us. Thanks for joining us. For Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie. We'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.